You think of Britain as our oldest ally. Now imagine waking up in 1930 and learning there's a locked file inside the US military that lays out a step-by-step blueprint to defeat the British Empire, quickly. Not as a classroom thought experiment. Not as a theory, a written plan with maps, timelines, and targets. And it begins with a jolt of logic you wouldn't expect. The shortest road to London runs through Canada. You and I grew up on the idea of a special relationship. We picture shared speeches, joint parades, the comfort of a common language. But in the years after World War I, American planners didn't build strategy on friendship. They built it on possibilities. They drafted color war plans for different major powers, contingencies for a world that could flip overnight. One of those plans had a name that sounds almost harmless: War Plan Red. In that file, red meant the British Empire. And Canada wasn't a footnote. Canada had its own label too. Because if you wanted to blunt Britain's reach, you didn't start across an ocean. You started by taking the closest British territory on the map. If this plan ever became real, it wouldn't begin with speeches. It would begin with rail lines, ports, and winter roads. Here's the rule you need to feel in your gut. Britain can't fight the United States without nearby platforms. If Red can use Canadian harbors, airfields, and supply hubs, the Atlantic suddenly feels smaller. And if you shut those hubs down, Britain's ability to project power shrinks fast, so the plan reads like a storm checklist. Priorities jump off the page: seize key crossing points, control the St. Lawrence, lock down Atlantic ports before reinforcements arrive. And yes, Toronto appears, not as a trophy, but as a node. A switchboard city. The kind of place that decides whether the whole network stays alive. You can almost hear the nervous question hiding behind every paragraph. What if the Royal Navy moves first? What if they pressure the US coastline? What if they strike Boston, New York, or the shipyards that feed American industry? Because in this scenario, you don't get to watch the war from a distance. You are the home front. Your harbors matter, your factories matter. Then the plan leans into its coldest logic. A long ocean isn't protection, it's a supply problem. The document talks about tightening control of sea lanes, cutting routes, and forcing Britain into impossible trade-offs as imports dry up. But Canada is only the opening move. Because once you picture American columns pushing north and coastal defenses bracing at home, something bigger clicks into place. If War Plan Red ever ignites, it doesn't stay in North America. In the next part, the first rush hits Montreal and Vancouver, while the Atlantic turns into a high-stakes chessboard. You and I are standing at the edge of a decision that changes everything. In this scenario, Washington doesn't debate for weeks. Orders go out fast. The first objective is blunt and practical. Take Canada's key cities before Britain can turn them into a launch pad. You feel it immediately. This isn't a distant war. It's fought on roads, rivers, rail lines, and ports right next to home. The opening moves revolve around the St. Lawrence River, because it's a straight corridor into eastern Canada. Control the crossings and the rail routes, and you control the flow of troops and supplies. U.S. planners lean on speed, not spectacle. The goal is to isolate Montreal, cut it off from reinforcements, and move before local defenses can fully organize. You watch units roll north from the border states using the same routes that usually carry trade. The pressure doesn't let up. The message is simple. Canada won't become a safe staging ground. At the same time, another push forms on the Pacific side. Vancouver matters because it connects the coast to the interior and sits on the seam between rail traffic and ocean traffic. If the U.S. takes Vancouver early, it blocks a major channel for outside support and reduces the risk of raids launched from nearby bases. The rhythm is the same: fast movement, tight objectives, and a focus on ports, rail yards, and communications. The plan isn't built around grand speeches. It's built around switches, choke points, and timing. But while the army drives north, the ocean becomes the real test. Britain's biggest advantage is the Royal Navy, and British leaders won't wait politely for the situation to settle. If they can show strength near the American coast, they can rattle confidence, disrupt shipping, and force the U.S. to pull resources away from Canada. In this timeline, hit back doesn't mean marching on Washington. It means making Americans feel the war in their stomachs. So, you brace for the moment New England would fear most. British warships off the Atlantic coast. Not to occupy the United States, but to squeeze it. They look for vulnerable pressure points, approaches to Boston, key shipping lanes, naval facilities, shipyards, fuel depots, anything tied to industry and morale. Even limited strikes or a short, sharp blockade attempt would be enough to trigger shortages, delays, and panic buying. You can picture the headlines. You can picture the empty shelves. You can picture families asking the same question at the dinner table. What happens if they come back tomorrow? And here's what makes it personal. The U.S. can't just surge into Canada and pretend the coastline doesn't exist. You and I both know the public would demand protection at home. That forces a hard choice with no clean answer. Do you send everything north to finish the job quickly? Or do you hold back ships, aircraft, and troops to guard the coast? In this scenario, Washington tries to do both by leaning on geography and industry. Canada is close, so American supply lines are shorter. U.S. factories can scale production quickly. Rail networks can shift men and material between fronts faster than Britain can move forces across an ocean. The whole plan depends on that speed. It assumes Montreal and Vancouver can be secured before Britain turns the conflict into a long, grinding contest. But even if the map looks perfect on paper, the sea doesn't care about paper. When the Royal Navy tests Boston's defenses, the stakes jump overnight. Because now the question isn't just whether you can take Canadian cities. The question is whether you can protect your own coast while you do it. And the answer to that is what decides what the rest of the world does next. You and I watch the map stop being a North American problem and start becoming a global one. Once Canada is under pressure, Britain can't treat this like a border crisis. London has to pull in the wider empire, because that's where its real strength lives. Ships, bases, raw materials, and trade routes stretched across oceans. And the moment Britain signals for help, you see the answer coming from far beyond the horizon. You see Australia step forward early, because it sits on critical sea lanes and has ports that can support long-range operations. You see India pulled in too, manpower, resources, logistics, because in this era, India is one of the empire's central pillars. You and I don't have to guess what that means. The conflict stops being about a handful of Canadian cities. It becomes a fight over shipping routes, ports, and the simple question of whether goods can keep moving. Pressure hits the Atlantic and the Pacific at the same time. Britain and its partners focus on the same strategy any maritime power would choose: cut American trade and force the United States to defend two coastlines at once. You picture convoys forming, escorts rushing into service, insurance rates jumping, and businesses bracing for delays. You and I know how quickly daily life changes when supply chains wobble. Even without shells landing near your home, you feel it at the store, at the fuel depot, and at the factory gate. But the United States has an advantage that's easy to underestimate until you see it wake up. American industry can pivot fast. Shipyards add shifts. Steel mills run hot. Railroads move coal, oil, and finished goods in massive volumes. Planners push for more cargo ships, more escorts, more aircraft, and faster training pipelines, because the goal isn't to win one dramatic battle, it's to win the calendar. If the U.S. can replace losses faster than the empire can absorb distance, the balance begins to tilt. And Washington leans hard on geography. America sits between two oceans, but it also sits on enormous internal resources. Oil from Texas and California, coal from Appalachia, iron and industry around the Great Lakes, paired with dense rail hubs that can move material without crossing hostile waters. You can feel the difference. The empire has to ship supplies across long distances and protect far-flung routes. The U.S. can often move critical inputs inside its own borders, under its own control. Then, the war turns into a game of bases and choke points. You hear names like Halifax, Bermuda, the Caribbean approaches, and Pacific outposts, spoken the way chess players talk about squares that decide the whole board. The Empire tries to use islands and distant ports as stepping stones for pressure and raids. The U.S. responds by tightening nearby waters, hardening coastal defenses, and trying to deny Britain the close options that make a naval war sustainable. And you realize how quickly this spreads. One decision pulls new regions into the same storm. Politics tightens right along with the shipping lanes. Neutral countries watch and hesitate. Trade partners stall. Markets flinch at every rumor. Every month becomes a contest of endurance. Who keeps factories running? Who keeps ships moving? Who keeps allies committed? Who keeps the public from getting tired? And that's the real turning point. If the U.S. outproduces the wider empire, Britain's advantage at sea starts to shrink. If Britain keeps pressure on both American coasts and stretches U.S. defenses thin, the conflict drags on until the costs feel unbearable. Either way, you and I can feel the stakes climbing again, because the next phase isn't about momentum anymore. It's about what the world looks like when one side finally runs out of options, and what happens when the map gets redrawn afterward. You and I reach the point where the fighting stops not with celebration, but with exhaustion and a new map. In this scenario, Washington never walks back its goals. From day one, Canada is treated as the central issue, and once Canada can no longer function as a separate platform for British power in North America, the United States moves to lock in the result. Temporary control turns into permanent control. American leaders convince themselves that leaving Canada independent only guarantees the same problem later. So a hard choice becomes policy. The United States annexes Canada and takes direct control of its borders, ports, and major rail routes. You feel what that means immediately, not as politics, but as daily life. New laws, new taxes, new identity papers, new trade rules, rolled out with the speed of a government that thinks it can't afford hesitation. Canadian officials are replaced, absorbed, or sidelined. American agencies expand overnight to manage new provinces, new legal systems, and a population that never asked to be folded into the United States. The strain runs both ways. Canadians resist in quiet ways and loud ways. Americans argue over the cost. And you realize that even a win comes with bills that don't expire when the shooting stops. Across the ocean, Britain faces a crisis it can't dress up. The empire was held together by confidence, shipping, and the belief that Britain could always protect its network. In this timeline, that image cracks early. If Canada is gone and British sea power has been stretched to the limit, London has fewer ways to reassure distant corners of the empire. You see leaders in Australia, India, and other regions begin to question the old promise, that Britain can always reach them, supply them, and defend them. And once people stop believing that promise, the whole structure starts to loosen in places Britain used to hold with ease. The unraveling doesn't happen in one dramatic day. You watch it in steps. Local leaders demand more autonomy. Trade routes shift away from London. Military planning changes. The empire's prestige drains faster than in our history, years, even decades sooner. Because the shock arrives earlier and resources are thinner. Britain still exists. It's still proud, still influential, still formidable in its own waters. But it no longer has the grip to steer a global system the way it once did. Then comes the twist that hits Americans the hardest. Britain's weakness doesn't create a stable partner. It creates a vacuum. The United States gains space, power, and responsibility, without a trusted equal beside it. Washington finds itself standing alone at the top of the world order much earlier than anyone expected. That sounds like strength, until you understand what it demands. More patrols, more bases, more commitments, more crises that land on American desks because there's nobody else big enough, close enough, and reliable enough to share the load. And you feel it at home. Taxes stay high to support new outposts and new sea lanes. Politics sharpens as people argue over what America is supposed to be now. Some parts of the economy surge, while others strain under the cost of managing a larger territory and a heavier global role. Culture shifts, too, because annexing Canada forces Americans to rethink what the country is and what it's becoming. So when you look back on War Plan Red in this timeline, you and I don't just see a secret file turned real. We see a turning point where America wins and still pays. The empire falls earlier, Canada disappears as a separate nation, and the United States steps into a lonely kind of leadership, one where every future emergency feels personal, and there's no older ally left to take half the weight.